May 1945, Bavaria, Germany. The fighting had ended. Thousands of German military officers sat confined in American prisoner of war camps, waiting to be released, and they began lodging complaints. The food wasn't up to their standards. The beds were uncomfortably firm. Hot water was scarce. They demanded to be treated with greater consideration. These were officers, after all. They felt entitled to a certain level of respect. Word of these grievances eventually made its way to General Patton. He went through them one by one. German officers pushing for comfort, expecting preferential treatment, carrying themselves as though the war had merely been an ordeal they'd been forced to endure. Patton came to a decision. He ordered trucks, had the complaining officers loaded onto them, and told them they were being moved to another facility. The convoy headed east through the Bavarian countryside until it arrived at a location the officers knew well, Dachau. Patton was bringing them to the concentration camp to show them where their victims had been forced to live, where they had endured unimaginable suffering, and where so many had perished. What happened when those German officers passed through those gates would extinguish their arrogance for good. This is the story of the tour that shattered their sense of superiority. Before we go further, be sure to subscribe. We share World War II stories about justice, consequences, and the moments that compelled people to confront what they had done. To grasp why Patton acted as he did, you need to understand the situation unfolding inside American POW camps in May of 1945. Germany had surrendered. Combat had ceased. And the American military now found itself responsible for hundreds of thousands of German captives, not just enlisted men, but officers, many of them. Colonels, majors, captains, men who had commanded divisions, led battalions, and fought their way across Europe. They were housed in camps scattered throughout Germany, temporary setups, tents, barracks, bare-bones accommodations. Nothing extravagant, but safe and sanitary, with meals 3 times a day and medical care available. By the measure of a prisoner of war camp, the conditions were decent, better, in fact, than German camps had afforded Allied prisoners, and better than these men had any reasonable right to expect. And still, they complained. Not quietly or among themselves. Formal written grievances, submitted through official channels, documented objections to their living arrangements. The complaints followed a strikingly familiar pattern. The food was inadequate. American rations fell below the dignity expected of German officers. They wanted German cuisine, prepared by German cooks. The sleeping arrangements were unacceptable. Cots in shared barracks. No privacy, no personal quarters. They were officers. They deserved proper rooms with real beds, not military cots. The sanitation was insufficient. Shared latrines, no hot water for bathing. They wanted proper bathrooms, hot showers, basic human decency. One complaint, filed by a German colonel, actually invoked the phrase Geneva Convention violations. He claimed that the conditions amounted to cruel treatment, and that Germany would never have subjected American officers to the same. The grievances accumulated, dozens, then hundreds. German officers who had spent years waging war across the continent were now demanding better accommodations from the very army that had beaten them. The complaints climbed through division headquarters, then corps headquarters, and ultimately landed on Patton's desk. Patton read through all of them. He sat at his desk surrounded by stacks of paper, formal written complaints from German officers, typed, signed, filed through proper channels. One demanded freshly laundered linens. Another requested coffee in place of tea. A major objected that meal portions were too small for a man of his rank. Patton's staff observed him as he read. His face betrayed nothing. No irritation, no amusement, only focus. When he had finished, he rose, crossed to the map hanging on his wall, traced a route with his finger, then turned to his chief of staff. Arrange transportation for approximately 200 German officers. Trucks, armed guards, tomorrow morning. Sir, are we relocating them to a different camp? In a manner of speaking. Which facility, sir? Patton pointed to the map. Dachau. The room fell silent. Sir, that's a concentration camp. It was. Now it's empty. The survivors have been evacuated. The camp has been left exactly as we found it. I want these complaining officers to see it. The staff officer hesitated. General, is that? I mean, are we permitted to bring prisoners of war to a historical site on German soil? Yes, Captain, we are. Make the arrangements. The following morning, 200 German officers were informed they were being transferred. They were loaded onto trucks, flanked by American guards carrying rifles and a military police escort. The officers assumed they were headed to a better facility. Finally, it seemed, someone had taken their complaints seriously. They were being moved somewhere more fitting for men of their rank. The convoy moved through Bavaria. The German officers peered out at their homeland. Some recognized the terrain. They were heading east, toward Munich. A colonel leaned toward a major seated beside him. Perhaps they're taking us to a proper military installation, somewhere more appropriate. The major agreed. About time. The conditions at that camp were beneath our standing. The trucks decelerated, turned off the main road, and the officers saw where they were going. A vast entrance gate. Electrified fencing stretching in both directions. Guard towers placed every 100 yards. And above the entrance, the inscription, Arbeit macht frei. Work sets you free. Dachau. The truck stopped. American soldiers ordered the Germans to disembark and formed them into rows. Patton stood waiting, positioned just inside the gate in full dress uniform. 4 stars polished, ivory-handled revolvers on his hips. He didn't raise his voice or shout. His tone was composed, cold. Gentlemen, you have submitted numerous complaints regarding your living conditions, the quality of your food, the comfort of your sleeping arrangements, the state of your sanitation facilities. You have argued that you are owed better treatment, and that your rank entitles you to certain standards. He paused, letting the silence stretch. I have brought you here to provide context, to show you what real standards actually look like. He turned to the American guards. Take them through. The tour began at the barracks, wooden structures built to hold perhaps 200 people. The Germans learned that the Nazis had crammed more than 1,000 into each one. The bunks rose 3 levels high. Bare wooden planks, no mattresses, no bedding, just rough timber. Men had slept pressed against one another, with barely space to shift position. An American guide, a lieutenant who had been part of the liberation force, explained in German. The prisoners slept in rotation. There wasn't enough room for everyone to lie down at once. They took turns. One German officer cut in. This is propaganda. No facility would confine people under these conditions. The lieutenant looked at him steadily. The prisoners we liberated told us firsthand. Some are still recovering in Munich hospitals. You're welcome to call them liars in person. They moved on to the punishment cells, cramped concrete rooms barely 4 feet by 4 feet, no windows, a drain set into the floor, nothing else. Prisoners were locked in here for days, the American explained. Sometimes weeks. No light, no toilet, just this drain. They stood because there was no room to lie down. The German officers had gone quiet. No further interruptions. They came to the medical experimentation rooms, the equipment still in place, the tables, the instruments, the records posted on the walls, detailed documentation of hypothermia trials, pressure chamber tests, experiments conducted on living human beings. One German officer retched and turned away. An American guard stopped him. No, you're going to look. You're going to see all of it. They were shown the crematoria, the furnaces where bodies had been incinerated, the scale of them, the industrial efficiency, the evidence of mass murder rendered mechanical and systematic. Patton had arranged something further, something that transformed observation into direct confrontation. Survivors, former prisoners still in the vicinity and recovering at nearby displaced persons camps, had been asked for volunteers. Dozens had come forward. They stood outside the barracks, gaunt figures in striped uniforms that hung loosely from their frames. Some could barely remain upright. Others steadied themselves with canes or crutches. They said nothing, made no accusations. They simply stood and looked at the German officers. The Germans could not hold their gaze. Eyes dropped to the ground, to their own feet, anywhere but the faces of those watching them. One survivor stepped forward, an elderly man, perhaps 70 years old. He pointed at a German colonel and spoke in German. I know you. You were at the labor camp in Poland in 1943. You sorted workers from our group and sent the rest to the gas chambers. You sent my son. He was 12 years old. You looked directly at him and pointed left, toward the chambers. You were smiling when you did it. The colonel's face drained of color. I was following orders. I wasn't. You smiled when you pointed. I remember. The colonel had no response. There was nothing to say. Another survivor spoke up, pointing at a different officer. You were at Mauthausen. You beat a man to death for taking an extra piece of bread. I watched it happen. The officer denied it. That wasn't me. You've confused me with someone else. I was never. The survivor pulled back his sleeve and exposed the tattooed number. I was there. I saw you. Don't tell me I'm mistaken. Patton let it continue. He let the survivors speak. He let them identify officers they recognized. He let them recount what they had witnessed. Some German officers attempted to defend themselves, claiming they had merely followed orders, that they hadn't known, that they bore no personal responsibility. The survivors didn't argue or debate. They simply looked at them. The evidence surrounding them spoke with more force than any words could. After 3 hours, Patton brought it to a close. He assembled the German officers in the assembly yard, the very ground where prisoners had been made to stand for roll call, where they had been counted and sorted for labor or death, where they had watched friends and family members taken away. Patton addressed them one final time. You complained about your food. You have just seen where men fought over scraps and starved to death within sight of garbage. You complained about your beds. You have just seen where thousands slept crammed together, standing in their own filth. You complained about dignity. You have just seen where human dignity was dismantled deliberately and completely, where people were reduced to numbers, starved, worked into the ground, murdered for the circumstances of their birth. You are officers in the army that did this. You took oaths to the regime that constructed this. You commanded men who stood guard over this. And you had the audacity to complain about cots and rations. He paused, letting the weight of it settle. You want better treatment? You are receiving it. You are alive. You are fed. You are safe. You are being treated better than you treated anyone who ended up in this place. And if you cannot understand why that is already more than you deserve, then you have learned nothing here today. He turned to the American guards. Return them to camp. The trucks drove back in complete silence. No conversation. No complaints. Nothing. When they arrived at the POW camp, the German officers went back to their barracks, their cots, their regular meals, their secure and uneventful captivity. The written complaints ceased, entirely, immediately. Not a single formal grievance was filed after that day. The American guards noticed something else as well. The German officers now cleared their plates at every meal, leaving nothing behind, wasting nothing. Some were observed quietly setting aside bread, tucking it away. Old instincts, from men who had now seen what genuine hunger looked like. Patton's decision provoked controversy. Some American officers argued it had been unnecessary, that it amounted to cruel treatment, that compelling prisoners to walk through a concentration camp constituted psychological abuse. Others held that it was entirely warranted, that these were men who had either actively participated in or enabled the Holocaust, and that making them face what their regime had wrought was justice, not cruelty. Patton never offered a public defense of the decision. He didn't feel the need to. When the question was put to him, he said simply, "They complained about privilege. I showed them what the complete absence of privilege actually looked like. If that troubles them, good." The survivors who had taken part, who had stood in that camp and faced the men responsible for their suffering, had varied reactions. Some found a measure of closure in it. At last, the men who had caused such destruction had been made to witness it, to stand in it, to acknowledge it. Others felt it changed nothing, that marching German officers through a camp couldn't undo the past, couldn't restore the dead, couldn't heal what had been broken. But all of them agreed on one thing. The complaints about food and beds and hot water had stopped. And that was something. Years later, historians would examine Patton's Dachau tour from various angles. Some viewed it favorably, as an early instance of compelling perpetrators to face their crimes, a forerunner of the war crimes tribunals, a step toward accountability. Others were more critical, calling it performative, arguing that 3 hours in a camp couldn't dismantle years of ideological conditioning, that many of the officers returned to their prior convictions, and that witnessing alone is not enough to produce genuine change. What is certain is this: 200 German officers who had submitted complaints about their treatment were taken to see what genuine mistreatment looked like, and they never lodged a complaint again. Whether they truly learned anything, whether they grasped the depth of what had occurred, whether they felt real remorse, that is a harder question to answer. But they learned to stay quiet. They learned that the men who had defeated them had seen what Germany had done. And they learned that complaining about personal comfort to those men would not be tolerated. If you had been standing in Patton's position, would you have done the same? Or would you have handled those complaints differently? Tell us in the comments. And if you want more stories about justice, consequences, and the moments that forced people to confront what they had done, be sure to subscribe.